Welcome, everybody, to this introduction to Gnostic psychology, especially as we study it from the perspective of the Gnostic tradition of Samal and Vior, especially. I think a lot of us can relate to some of the struggles that are going on in the world. We see a lot of chaos and confusion, a lot of suffering prevalent in our communities, perhaps with our families or spouse, our loved ones, and we may seek some deeper insights into how to rectify that pain, whether of a mental, emotional type, not merely just the physical. Primarily, the beautiful utility of this tradition is that we have many tools and exercises that we use to better understand ourselves and to know how to better relate to the humanity. And so, what we'll do in this course is explore some practical tools and techniques by which to better understand our life and how it is we create suffering, but also how to prevent and overcome it. What we'll do specifically with this lecture is talk about identity. If we're interested in studying who we are, knowing our full depths and potential, what we can become, but also how to change the trajectory of our existence, it's important to understand what identity really is. And obviously, in these modern times, we have many resources, and there are medical health professionals and individuals who study psychology, all with many useful forms of analysis and diagnostics, as well as insights and knowledge about how to treat human beings. And primarily, what we'll do in this tradition, or in this lecture specifically, is study the nature of identity, not from a materialistic perspective, but from a spiritual one. So while we don't devalue the utility of certain psychometric techniques or assessments of a person's psychology and inner character, we do want to emphasize that there are more profound means of apprehending the nature of who we are. And this is not merely based on any type of external battery, some type of analysis of, or test, better said. Instead, what we want in this tradition is to personally experience the full gamut of who we are, to understand their roots. By understanding ourselves from our own experience and applying, in this tradition, specific spiritual techniques like meditation, we can learn to go deeper than the material, go deeper than the cultural, go deeper than mere mind. So primarily our focus is to witness for ourselves and apply techniques for ourselves to see results, primarily in terms of transforming those deep-rooted, perhaps, patterns of our own psyche, which may create problems for ourselves and for others. What we'll do specifically in this lecture is precisely to identify the nature of identity from this perspective. We're going to outline some distinct, as well as disparate and maybe even integral forms of self, from the external, the more superficial levels, to the internal, the most genuine and real. And primarily, as we titled this course, To Thine Own Self Be True, we want to understand the authentic state of spiritual being, what it means to be, in a real practical sense, spiritual, not from a state of belief, but from experience, to understand deeper phenomena, or better said, noumena within our own interior, which we can test and verify for ourselves. So primarily when we study religions or different traditions, we may find that religions have different terms for the experience of divinity and the real. And primarily the purpose of this lecture is to understand ourselves so that we can understand and have a deeper relationship with divinity. This means that we explore ourselves from the external to the internal, what is most authentic and genuine, which produces the most happiness in our life. We're also going to provide some spiritual parameters for understanding identity, inner transformation, and the reunion with divinity. Not merely some abstract figure in the clouds, but a state of perception, a state of consciousness. We'll also introduce ways to cultivate a profound relationship with our divine being, our real self, mapping out common dangers and pitfalls, as have been outlined in some different religious traditions, but here we give more secular terms for those who may not be familiar with, in a sense, or have been brought up in a particular faith. And lastly, we're going to define and elaborate the nature of what sacred individuality is, how to realize our most authentic potential. Specifically, as we've kind of outlined already, there exists many types of metrics of a psychological type, analyzing personality, the nature of identity, in terms of one's characteristics and attitudes, ways of perceiving the world, ways of acting. These are useful, and primarily what I want to emphasize in this lecture is that in the Gnostic tradition, we have our own spiritual metrics for identifying and understanding being, what it means to be, to exist. We included some images here, one of some Russian dolls with 3 layers, because as we are going to outline in this lecture, there are layers to our personality and identity and experience, which go from the outer to the inner. And so we'll sequence our analysis of a particular gamut or spectrum of perception and being in this way. We'll talk about personality, which is like a mask, as you see here, our outward form. We also go deeper into what we call ego, self, a little bit further down, like you see here an image of a monstrous creature, which can personify many elements like anger and pride, negative psychological states. And then going even deeper than that, we find the most intrinsic reality of our being, which is symbolized by a child, known as the essence. In a sense, these 3 layers or 3 constituents of being constitute our full self in the most practical sense. Layers upon layers, levels. We'll identify what these all are, starting from the outer to the inner. More importantly, we want to frame this lecture with a quote from Hamlet, because as beautifully stated by Shakespeare, primarily what any person seeks in life is authenticity. And that is oftentimes something, in a sense, very difficult to define, to pinpoint, or to touch. And yet we can sense it in our interactions and experiences with others, our family, our profession, our marriage. What we want primarily is to understand these 3 aspects of self, personality, ego, and essence, so that we can be more true to ourselves and be true to humanity. In a sense, to be true to our real self is primarily to be true to the most divine, intrinsic, and real part of us that can transform our communities and produce the real happiness that we long for. It can also resolve conflict, but that requires that we go from perhaps the more superficial and obvious surface level aspect of our identity and go within the essence to what some people might call the inner child, right? As we see here in the bottom right image. But obviously, we're not using this term in the pop culture sense of the word. We're talking about the real part of us that is still innocent and that can learn to navigate competently in the world. Polonius stated to Laertes in Act 1, Scene 3, lines 78 to 80, in the play Hamlet by Shakespeare, a axiom which many people repeat and which is the focus of this series of lectures. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. Pretty sure we all can pinpoint maybe people in our lives or maybe even in ourselves, elements that are fake, perhaps artificial or contrived, maybe negative or harmful. And so what we want is to understand these layers of our identity so that by contextualizing them, at least in this lecture, to understanding them in our own life, we can enact the changes and sincere depth of being and experience of life in its most full sense. We'll talk about the personality first. Personality literally comes from, I believe, either the Latin or the Greek personae, which means mask. It is our outward identity. It is the mask we wear in life. It is our appearance. It is our culture. It is our ethnicity or race. It is our language. It is our customs, our habits, our tastes, our appetites. Personality is something that we acquire. It's something that we are developing initially after our first 4 to 7 years of existence, as we start to gain more aptitude and maturity. We're growing up. Personality is a bit of an interface. It's how we interact with the world. And as we're young children, learning to basically exist in life, we acquire a language, we're given a name, we develop certain appetites, we become acculturated to our parents. As we grow up, we become educated. We learn from our environment, from our schools. We even learn from our circumstances. These all shape our personality. And personality is basically a mask. It is an interface. It is, in a sense, a form of energy developed by many elements. In one sense, we are also developing personality because of our inheritance. Three terms we utilize in this tradition to emphasize these three components of how our personality is initiated and developed and forms. We call it genotype, phenotype, paratype. Our genotype obviously relates to genes, our biology. We inherit aspects of personality from our inheritance, from our parents, from our ancestors. And these things help to get the ball rolling as we are initiated into life, as we're born. And also, we are also shaped by our education. What happens to us at school, in our environment, our family, our education shape a lot of how we see the world. And in a sense, this personality is a type of seeing the world or a way of seeing the world that really grows and develops throughout time. Now, the thing to remember is that personality is something contextual. It's related in this sense to a specific time or place. The personality we develop in, say, North America may be distinct from growing up in China. And we have different values and tastes, ways of seeing the world, appetites, ways of identifying with the world that vary with the context of where we grew up. So personality, obviously, in this sense, is very superficial. It's not the deepest part of who we are, although much of how we interact with the world depends on personality. We need it. It is a part of being in existence. The thing to remember too is that personality changes throughout time. Personality is affected and formed not merely by our early experiences in childhood, but also circumstances. If you imagine a soldier going to war, their personality can receive a terrible shock from a violence of a conflict. And what's particularly important to note is that our personality can be, in a sense, shattered, sick, hurt. This explains why people with PTSD may suffer from trauma, and in a sense, that is compounded by a fracture in the personality because a traumatic moment or event had seriously affected the person. But also, this is the same dynamic in terms of good experiences. Our personality is changed and developed in accordance with life circumstances. And these are always changing. These are always affecting and entering as experiences through us. And our personality helps to shape the way we see the world. Now, what's also important to note is that personality, as we hinted at, is time. Personality belongs to a specific time and place. It's our culture, as I said, what we inherit, and that it is an energy that is born and dies. It is born in time and it dies in time. Personality is necessary in life. We need personality in order to exist in the world. We need language and custom and cultures and these things to help us interact with people. Now, to demonstrate how personality is really contingent upon a specific time and place, a specific time is evident by certain comedy films where people would time travel, such as you take a Roman soldier from antiquity and bring him to New York City. Imagine what would happen. That soldier would be totally disoriented. They would not know how to interact with people. They would have a shock. They would flounder and create all sorts of confusion for themselves because they don't know how to interact with a specific time or place. Not to say that Times Square isn't disorienting in itself, even for people of this time and place, but it does mean that personality is related to a specific moment in history. And so personality also is born in time and it dies in time. The perception of people seeing ghosts at cemeteries or certain haunted places is often labeled as the souls of the dead. But in truth, what these people tend to sense who are more sensitive to these type of psychic perceptions is not the soul of a dead person, but their personality. Ghosts are the remnants of personality. They don't have a type of real objective consciousness about them. They're a bit of a energetic specter that hangs around depending on how much energy the person invested in it through their lifetime. So people who have a very fat personality, people who are into maybe film or entertainment industries who rely on the personality to make a living in a commercial sense, in a maybe like a YouTuber or someone who is very um, very much engaged with gathering a large audience. Those people invest a lot of energy in their personality, and the personality, when the person dies, hangs around. It remains along the grave of the dead. And so these are remnants of personality. They're not the soul of the person who is deceased. What's also important to note too is that personality is something we acquire with life. We acquire it when we are born. We lose it when we die. More importantly, we develop a new personality every time we are born. But obviously, we don't typically remember this process because psychologically, spiritually speaking, we're asleep. We tend to return to new existences without comprehension of where we came from or consciousness of where we had emerged or where we're going. This is known as transmigration. People often coin it as reincarnation, but in these studies, we call it reincorporation because we don't will it. It happens to us. It's not conscious. So every time we're born in life, we develop a new personality in order to learn how to be in the world in a specific time and place. And this is something that we can verify through practices like meditation, by awakening our full consciousness so that we can remember. Now, more importantly, when we're talking about um, our psychology, we're going to go a little deeper. So personality, as I said, is our mask. But what is behind the mask? We call this the ego. Ego in Latin means I or self. Ego is anger, pride, vanity, lust, hatred, greed, laziness, gluttony, competition, ambition, avarice, many defects. We often think of ego in terms of Freud or Jung as a type of self that gives us a type of cohesion in life. We're using the term ego in a little bit of a different sense. Ego in the Gnostic tradition refers to a conglomerate of different selves. In strict spiritual or esoteric psychology, ego, self, is egos and multiplicity. We have multiple senses of self. In a sense, our personality can have many levels and layers. We can have, in a sense, sub-personalities operating beneath the surface. Even deeper, we have egos, states of being, or better said, states of dysfunctional consciousness, conditioned perception, which operate in accordance with these negative elements. It is a multiplicity. It's not a singularity. Ego is a multiplicity of I's, a sense of me, myself. This was represented in the Greek mythology as the Hydra. A Hydra has many heads. Each serpentine head is a different defect. It's a different self. It's a different state of being. It's a different state of consciousness, but one that is trapped and conditioned by the negativity that characterizes it. All the great heroes of the Greek myths had to fight terrible monsters. Those monsters are precisely these different defects, desires, we can say, egos, which trap our full potential. And in fact, are the origin of our pain in life. However, we don't tend to see this. We don't see this reality in ourselves because, for one thing, we're not trained to really observe our psychological processes. We don't really have tools or techniques traditionally to learn how to know ourselves deeply. But if we are attempting to study a course of this nature, we begin to explore and seek to know the full depth of who we are. What's important to note too is that a defect, an ego, or better said, every ego is a defect. It's a fault. It's an error. Defect comes from the late Middle English as a noun is influenced by the Old French defect, deficiency, from the Latin defectus, or the past participle of deficere, to desert or fail. From e, expressing reversal, and facere, to do. Specifically, every defect is a deficiency. It's an error because anger and pride, vanity and lust, many negative psychological elements are not optimal. They're not the best way to live. And our modern culture, unfortunately, basically deifies anger and vilifies patience. We're taught in our education or in our movies and television to worship, basically said, these hydras, right? Anger and pride and lust and fear. We may say one thing, but in truth, our addiction to television and movies that are saturated with pride and anger show us that we are very much identified with our defects. We identify with them. And that these are a deficiency. They're not the best way to live. And obviously, we know from personal experience that, these states produce suffering, but yet we continue to feed into them. We desert or fail, in a sense, to defect in the military sense from our spiritual duty. And our spiritual duty is to confront the conglomerate of multiple defects in ourselves and to understand them so that we can change. Now, what's important to remember is that every ego acts in accordance with its own will. So to demonstrate the multiplicity of self, we can highlight a simple example from perhaps our daily experience. We may be married to some person. In one moment, we have intense love, infatuation, affection, or desire for them. And in the next moment, maybe that sentiment may be replaced with anger, resentment, jealousy, pride, fear, insecurity, jealousy. In one moment, we love them, and the next, we hate them when circumstances present the opportunity. This simply demonstrates that we don't have consistency or integrity within our psychology. We're thrown about by disparate influences within our own psychology. We tend to be driven by these defects because we don't see them in action. We're not looking for, insight into our own nature. We tend to just get pulled along by circumstances. And in this sense, this makes us very incapable people. We're not fulfilling a divine will in us. We're just tossed by the wind. In one moment we're hungry, and the next we want to go ride our bike. We may then have the desire to read. Different thoughts, feelings, and wills. Multiplicity, not integral. And this is contrary to divine will. A divine will is an individual self, a state of being that is not pulled about by contradiction or is not defined by contradiction. And in a sense, a integral sense of identity indivisible self, a real self, is one that is capable of real action. It makes sense conceptually that if you take a cup of water and spill it outside of its cup, it diffuses within its environment. But when you keep it within a cup and it is integrated as a totality, it has more substance and reality. Our will is like that. Our will tends to be our will tends to be dispersed amongst disparate senses of will, desires in multiple directions. So in a sense, we don't really do anything spiritually. Life happens to us and we react. These are mechanical and repetitive states of perception. And as we're hinting at, our ego traps our soul, our full potential. Our consciousness, which could be indivisible and divine, is trapped within mechanical, reactive states, repetitive states of being, which are processed by virtue of their conditions like anger and pride and fear. These all are repetitions of our past mistakes. These defects, in a sense, really compel us upon the path of pain. And it is these egos that we wish to understand, to comprehend, and more importantly, to eliminate. Now, more importantly, to understand ourselves, understand the ego or each ego so that we can really remove them and free ourselves entirely of our own mechanical patterns. We have to understand how does each ego act. Now, imagine life circumstances like a stage. You're at a concert and you are the performer. You're also the audience. When you have the mic, you sing the part of the song as part of the show and then move on to the next part. Each person in the audience is an ego. And every once in a while, a certain ego gets up on stage when the circumstance is appropriate, grabs the mic, thinks, feels, acts, and speaks in accordance with its condition. And when it is satisfied, it moves on. And then another defect takes over. Our egos are the originators of all the distinct comedies, dramas, and tragedies in each life. In a sense, our egos are very deep and ancient. They're very deeply rooted in us, which is why we tend to repeat behaviors that even conceptually we know may be wrong, and yet we're addicted to them. It's because all these events in life are triggering these reactions, and because we've invested so much energy in these elements, they perpetuate all the situations that occur in our life, all the fun, hilarious, dramatic, tragic parts of our existence. There are egos deeply related to each circumstance in life, which perpetuate the drama of our existence. These egos manifest at appropriate times. They feed on circumstances. They're like an actor in a script. They're in a play following their lines. They have a song or title to preach. And when they fulfill their role, they move on or they disappear from the screen of our awareness and we're compelled by another element. What's important to note too is that every ego operates in a series. They operate in sequences and also teams. You may have a situation at work where a coworker maybe says something slightly insulting. Perhaps our mind interprets it that way. We suddenly feel hurt, resentment, followed by maybe the pride and anger that follows in sequence. And then we may even feel intense fear for our job, for our security, because we're being criticized. Now, this is a very simple example, but I'm pretty sure we can find any moment in our life where we see a series of reactions if we're watching, if we're looking at what's going on in ourselves, we're observing the fact. It's rare that certain defects emerge independently by themselves, isolated from others. Our defects tend to be intimately connected. And that's why self-study and psychological introversion is so difficult because our mind is super complex. We have a lot of complex traumas and psychological elements that are tied together in a very intricate net, which keep us, in a sense, inert and stuck. But the way to resolve those problems psychologically is to understand all the networks and series of events outside of us, but also all the associative chains of relationality between our defects, how anger relates to pride and triggers the fear and is associated with um, jealousy, whatever it may be. You can't label or contextualize everything because, there's just so much. But this whole web of psychological reactions tends to keep us spiritually hypnotized, right? We tend to just feel and think and act on these desires, but without questioning them. We're asleep. In a sense, we're also possessed. We're possessed by anger in a moment of heated debate, almost by a demon, right? When anger takes over with its thoughts, its intensity, its temperature, we boil and it takes over us. People who are blinded by anger are possessed by an inner demon, an inner element, an ego. And once a person is trapped in the moment, it can be very difficult to diffuse it. This is why in the Greek myths of Medusa, she turns men into stone. When looking directly into her eyes through the many vipers on her head, a person is petrified. That is a symbol of how, if we give our energy to these elements, a very strong ego or a series of egos, we become trapped. We become stone. We can't act spiritually, meaning it doesn't mean physically we don't react. It just means that our spiritual potential, which could transform this whole dynamic, is wasted. It's stone. It can't move, can't act. And we just go along with the reaction. Similar to the Hydra, obviously, those serpents on the head of Medusa are all the different egos we possess, their complexity and intricacy and, you know, multidimensionality. I mean, one thing to remember too is that we use the seven deadly sins as a label, as a generic framework for interpreting what the ego is and how it acts. For example, pride can be very lustful, anger can be very proud, fear can be very gluttonous. It's not easy to label or really understand the deep roots of each defect and how they possess us and control us. But in the beginning, we use, these parameters to understand, at least initially, to get a sense of what's going on. In a sense, we're trapped in our reactions whenever we identify with the situation, rather than being self-possessed and in control. That has to do with learning to be mindful of ourselves, to watch all of the processes of our reactions in relationship to the diverse struggles and circumstances of existence, so that we can gain understanding and not get pulled around so easily, gain some control of our psychological universe. Each ego also steals energy. Now, as I hinted at, when we look into Medusa's eyes, we are stone, we give it our energy. In the same way, our anger or pride or fear as an ego is like a vampire. And this is actually the original symbolism of that myth. Egos are like vampiric, parasitical elements. They feed off the energy of our psyche, our soul, that which energy which is free and can be used spiritually, but tends to be wasted by expenditures of anger, atomic explosions of envy. It's an explosion of force, whenever we invest our energy into a negative state of being. Obviously anger is the most obvious. It's explosive. We give it our energy, we feel depleted. And that anger, rather than going away, is just like a lion that's fed on a zebra. It gets stronger. And then when it gets hungry again, it's going to come back. So those new age and even pop psychological attitudes or platitudes of giving into one's anger as a form of catharsis, as a form of release, is wrong, because it's just feeding the beast. It's going to make it stronger. Now, this doesn't mean we repress anger and hide it, because that just makes it even more violent when it does emerge. Instead, what we want is comprehension. So every ego is a false creation. It's a vampire. It's undead. It's not a spiritually living integral divine being. It's in fact a parasite, as I said. It feeds off the energies of our soul. And the ego is what limits us. It's also the ego that must die. So this topic often frightens people. Obviously, when we talk about the multiplicity of self, that can be very discouraging and alarming, but it's something that we can verify and learn to understand and rectify. Our ego limits us, obviously, from the examples we've given. This is symbolized in the myth or folk tales of the genie and Aladdin's lamp. Every ego is like a bottle. It cages our soul, our full potential. And if we wish to free the genie, the real source of genius, ingenuity, real creative being, that which is most spiritual and divine, our essence or soul, we have to break the bottle. Break the bottle, you free the genie. You can perform any wish you want, spiritually speaking. The bottle has to break. In the same way, a seed must die in order for a tree to be born. The same process applies to our psychology. The ego traps our full potential, our genius, our conscious ability to intelligently navigate the troubles of life. Now, the thing to remember too is that talking back to or hearkening back to reincorporation, our ego is very ancient. Personality is temporal. Our personality is born in time and dies in time. But when the mask goes to the grave and a physical body dies, the ego reincorporates. Now, the ego is what returns to each existence. It doesn't reincarnate. Reincarnation is something else. Reincarnation has to do with a spiritual and integrated divine individual choosing to incorporate within a certain time and place to help humanity. That's something very elevated and spiritual. Most of us didn't choose to be here. We just returned. We're mechanical. The ego has desires, its desires that were not satisfied, and therefore, when our former physical body died, we reincorporated in accordance with its former causes, conditions, and trajectory. It's like the crest of a wave on an ocean that crashes at the appropriate time and then reforms according to the current of the ocean. The same thing with the ego. It's like a cyclical wave. So the ego is primarily really the result of multiple lifetimes of experience. It gets complicated each time. It builds up energy more and more, develops more and more, gets fatter more and more, depending on our actions, and is the reason why our world is a mess. We have so much ego from our previous experiences that now, really, our ego has reached its crest and now it's beginning to crash. It's beginning to devolve, to decay. It's just too much weight in the psyche that is beginning to break down. It's beginning to take us in a negative direction. It's important to realize too, the personality is formed in the first few years of existence, and we develop a personality in our early childhood so that our ego can reincorporate. Now, what's interesting is that, personality is the mask that we develop in order to be in the world. It's also a tool by which our ego can come back from its previous existences. Now, some people have reported, and this is something that you can personally experience too, memories from their childhood where being in the crib, especially at an age like 2 or 3 or 4, and then seeing shadows or ghosts flitting about the bedside. So I'm not talking about ghosts in the terms of personality, but an example of how young children, as they're developing personality, see their own egos trying to reincorporate within their bed. And so oftentimes they see these monstrous figures and they cry. They feel fear. They see these demons trying to enter them. And until that personality in the child develops, that the ego can't incorporate. But when it does, that's when children start to get really nasty, right? I mean, maybe they develop a temper, they become angry, they develop all the egotistical qualities that, really make adults horrendous, in the real sense of the word. So the personality is what allows the ego to reincorporate. Now, the thing to remember too is that we don't have to necessarily repeat this whole process again and again. Developing personality, reincorporating the ego, going along with the flow of its whims. Instead, we can learn to identify our own defects and learn to disintegrate ego so that we free the soul or consciousness that is trapped there. So every ego is a defect that traps the soul, traps consciousness. This is paralleled within Jungian psychology as integrating the shadow. Obviously, they talk about the shadow self, the negative aspects of personality or identity that can be integrated to form a more fully cohesive being. In the sense, like a person or young man who has a lot of aggression can learn to integrate that drive and make themselves more assertive, which can be a good skill to have, especially in life. We're a little bit deeper in this tradition when we talk about disintegrating the ego, because by eliminating anger, we free patience and serenity, sweetness. By eliminating lust, we develop purity of our energy, mind, heart, and body. By annihilating envy, we have really philanthropy and happiness for others. There are virtues that are trapped in each defect, and by eliminating each defect, we free virtues. This helps to end our cyclical reactions to contemporary life so that we have more integration and cohesion as well as cessation of pain. We have real freedom and happiness when we liberate the soul. This is why we talk about the essence. This has to do with the nature, qualities, powers, and perceptions of our spiritual identity. So going from the outward to the inner, we're now emphasizing the real spiritual, intrinsic, true nature of our being. The essence, the soul, the essence of who we really are, our reality, is symbolized by a child. That child, not to use the conventional pleonasm of the inner child that we all seek to access, which has some validity and credence, but the essence is a child because not only is that pure and innocent and divine and sacred, but also that essence is undeveloped. It's not perfected. It's not mature yet. When we see young children before the ages of 4, especially, maybe a little longer if we're lucky, those children have a beauty and innocence that is very difficult to pinpoint, and yet we all recognize and are humbled by it, inspired by it, especially when we see the youth and vitality and innocent joy they express. Our essence, our soul, is active within the ages of 0 to 4, especially. So when we're very young children, when we don't have the personality fully developed yet, it's the essence that is most active then. Now, the thing to remember too is that the essence, our soul, our consciousness, which are synonymous terms, is precisely that quality in us that can experience, the reality of divinity. It's what allows us to facilitate perception of divine reality. It's what allows us to have spiritual and religious experiences. It's what connects us to our inner divinity. It is also our real self, what is eternal and divine, essential. That's why we call it the essence. It's timeless because it doesn't belong to a certain time period. It's not something we acquire through mechanical means, like developing a personality. It just comes to us. It's something that we have to develop willingly through a specific work. And as I said, our essence is most prominent between birth and 4 years of age, especially. Obviously, with the complication and heaviness of our current psychological environment with humanity, the density of life itself, that's beginning to change and become much earlier because there are a lot of forces at work spiritually in our humanity that are bringing about more suffering. This is related to the intensity of our former actions, our desires, our egos that are making life very complicated, especially at a young age. Now, the essence is like a seed. In the beginning, it develops insufficiently in youth. It's something that spontaneously flourishes. in our younger years, between 0 and 7. But what happens is that when we incorporate personality and ego, we lose that. We become layered and conditioned by our desires, our egos. What's also important to note too is that the soul needs to be actively worked upon. It can't develop mechanically. It doesn't just happen because of evolution, by some external force that's going to drive humanity towards some spiritual golden age. It doesn't happen that way. It happens like a seed emerging from the soil and becoming a tree with much care, tending, attention, and work. It's something that has to be cultivated personally. It doesn't come about by inheritance through life experiences just by themselves. It requires a certain attitude shift and internal psychological work. The essence needs to learn to develop maturity and to grow. And that comes about through spiritual exercises, especially like meditation, fundamentally. Now, when young children are born and they have their essence activated, they're able to remember many things that we don't in our maturity and adulthood. Some people have mentioned that they have experienced memories from their early childhood where they were able to see many things and remember where they came from, their past existences, even remembering their birth, the moments thereof, even the moments before they were physically born. That's because the essence of those people was activated to some degree. They were perceptive of life before entering the body. And what happens is that these children often cry in pain, realizing that they were born in another existence they've reincorporated. And so what happens to these people, is that children, in a sense, can really see us for who we are. And therefore, they may cry because they see our own defects and how ugly we are, right? This is an inversion of our contemporary attitudes about children, that, children are young and learning to develop in the world, which is, true. But also, spiritually speaking, they see many things about us that we don't because we tend to be asleep. Specifically, the essence can only awaken from its slumber, its inertia, and develop through intentional, conscious works, and more specifically, voluntary suffering. This word might frighten people. Voluntary suffering. This doesn't mean to go look for trouble, circumstances that are going to challenge us. It means that when we face the hardships of life and face the reactions of our own mind, we voluntarily and willingly face it so that we can consciously work upon our reactions, our egos. And in that way, with intentional efforts, we develop more rigorous perception of our real identity, which in its virginal state is not yet trapped by these disparate elements like anger and pride. So we have a division of self. We have our, consciousness, our essence, we can say, the ego and personality. Even deeper beyond the essence is our being. Our being is the divine self, which we characterize with a image known in the Hebrew tradition as Kabbalah. This is a glyph or map of different levels of being, from the most material, concrete, and dense below to the most abstract, refined, and spiritual above. It is a map of consciousness. In a sense, what we talked about today can correlate with these different circles or spheres, which represent different qualities of consciousness. Now, the higher we go in this glyph, not in verticality in space, but elevation of spiritual morals and being, we access more divine states of self, which are not self in the sense we commonly think of. In fact, our real identity is not characterized by a sense of I or me. It is a state of being that is not conditioned by attachment, aversion, or fear. It is states of divine perception that are not limited to our egotism. The spirit, the divine being, the self, our real identity is beyond the essence. And our essence is what can connect us to our tree of life, as we see here. This image, known as Kabbalah, is a map. And this map helps us to orient ourselves in relationship to our inner divinity and to understand different experiences that we have in meditation. Now, we synthesize it here because this tree of life is our real identity. We are a seed that could become a sapling. And when that seed is fully developed, the essence is fully perfected. It learns to navigate and understand all the levels and layers of these spheres, these different dimensions of consciousness, not only in nature, but also in oneself. In that way, we're integrated. We are fully masters of oneself. And the whole purpose of understanding these three aspects of personality, ego, and essence is to understand our relationship to the divine, which is mapped in this glyph. We'll come back to this image again and again many times because it's very intricate and very deep. We just simplify it here in the context of our psychological studies. It's important to reflect too about how we use personality, because this is something we all can identify with easily, but also sometimes we may struggle to understand how to use it effectively. Now, as I said, personality is a mask. It is a interface that we use to interact with the world. The question becomes, who is using our personality, our name, our language, our culture, our customs, our appetites, our tastes, our habits, our behaviors, our ways of seeing the world? Who is driving that? Who is behind the mask? We learn this through direct observation. We learn this by activating our consciousness, by learning to pay attention. We observe what is going on. We watch ourselves. We activate our essence to watch, to observe. The essence, the seed of the soul, must be activated. These qualities of the essence are virtues and qualities like patience and serenity, observation, attention, mindfulness, remembrance, paying attention, acting on noble states of character, virtue, responsibility, serenity, patience, diligence. The essence or the soul is qualified by all the divine aspects of self that we venerate within great luminaries and prophets or initiates that have come to humanity who founded different religions. Now, what they emphasize in their teaching is that we need to understand who is driving the mask. Are we observing who is interacting with the world? We watch ourselves, we observe our reactions, and we observe what's going on outside of us. This is not something that we can know passively. It's something that we have to pay attention to. It doesn't come about mechanically. We have to direct attention, observe ourselves, like we're watching an actor in a film. And then by observation, we learn to see the personality. How does it work? How can we use it? What are its purposes? We need to comprehend the utility, but also the danger of personality, especially in relationship to attention, energy, and groups. This is important to emphasize. Personality is useful in its sphere when it is controlled. But when it dominates a person's interactions, that personality also, in a sense, steals energy, focus, and priority. There have been many spiritual movements and groups that have been ruined because of personality, where the individuals or teachers leading or co-facilitating have developed a fat personality at the expense of their essence or their soul. And so while we need the personality to exist in the world, we don't want it to be the priority. We don't want it to be the sole emphasis characterizing who and what we do. We use it like a tool. We use it like a carpenter uses a hammer, or a person building a plane uses certain equipment. There's a certain use for it, but it's useful in its orbit. But when taken out of its sphere, when it predominates, that's when you have groups dominated by cults of personality, where people worship basically that and not their own inner divine being, their divine self. This means we learn to pacify the personality. Personality has to be used, but also it has to be under control. It has to be calm, has to be utilized to a degree and in a way that is conscious, not just mechanical. Now, the ego can use the personality, or it could be our essence. And we do so through awareness, self-observation, mindfulness, and attention. These are exercises that we explain in another lecture called Observe Your True Self. This is how we discern our true identity and cultivate spiritual harmony, balance. So, one thing to understand too is that our personality is something terrestrial, but that also divinity has a type of personality, not in our conventional sense or even in the Gnostic sense of the word, but in a spiritual sense. Our divinity has a type of character unlike what we know now. And as we see here an image of Tutankhamun, the golden sarcophagus, bearing his mummy, this is a symbol of a golden personality, the golden nature of the spirit. Our divinity has tremendous character, beautiful qualities, limitless, almost as, sometimes as sweet as a melody of Mozart to as severe as a Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. There's a divine character embodied in such music by those artists who are characterizing the personality of divinity. And so we want to learn what that quality is in us. Our divinity has a type of character that we need to access and learn about that, basically just emphasizes our real self, not something static and dead, but something dynamic and powerful, nuanced. The essence is a child, a seed that must grow up. It must become mature. The soul or seed of our spiritual potential must learn to develop, to no longer be divided amongst multiple aggregates or states of ego, but must be integrated and freed, psychologically integrated. There's a sometimes disturbing statistic that Samal and Vieira gives in his books about the nature of our psychological ratios, in the sense that we have a certain percentage of ego and a certain percentage of essence. He says that we are 97% egotistical, trapped in defects, and 3% free. However, that 3% of essence is not yet activated or awake. It is that 3% essence, that seed, that embryo that can develop into a master. And that only comes about by perfecting the essence, by eliminating all our defects. In this way, by destroying each ego and freeing the consciousness that is trapped there, we integrate our soul so that it has power. This explains why individuals like Jesus of Nazareth or Buddha or many saints perform miracles, because they had their essence integrated and their essence united with divinity, and that gave them power. Power over nature, power over themselves. One cannot be like Moses unless one is a master of oneself, a real individual, indivisible, pure. All the world mythologies and scriptures point towards this potential of what we can become. It's useless to believe in external personalities or the dead personalities of people like Jesus. He's a great master. He did this work. He even reached the point where he no longer needed his personality because he had integrated himself with divinity and therefore is a master of masters. It's useless to follow or adhere to an idea in one's mind of a physical historical person of the past. They can inspire us in our work to become what we must become. But belief doesn't change anybody. Experience does. Action does. And really, to be through the power of love is precisely a deep psychological work whereby we eliminate our defects and integrate the soul so that we learn how to be in the present moment, a master of ourselves, embodying the real full gamut of divine love. In synthesis, we have a book that you can study, which goes into greater detail than we covered today. It's called Treatise of Revolutionary Psychology by Samal and Vieira. I highly recommend you study this book, for it gives a deep outline of how to study oneself how to begin this type of psychological understanding of ourselves. At this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Feel free to type them in the chat. We have a question. So trauma only affects personality and not soul? No. Personality, ego, and essence, in a sense, are all different layers of experience. Now, what's important to remember is that some traumas are so intense that they hit very deep into oneself. Some are more superficial, some are more profound. Obviously, the more intense an experience, the more energy it's invested or that can break a person. So the personality can shatter, right? And you find that some people suffer certain conditions because, they went through a horrible experience. There are deeper traumas related to acting on elements of ego, which are very negative, which, in a sense, can produce some cases of trauma too, acting on certain defects, which create harm for oneself and for others. But there's also traumas of the soul. In a sense, those spiritual traumas are very deep. They are wounds that the consciousness feels because the soul is not something dead and inert. It's something very vibrant and sensitive, very strong and profound. But even the soul can experience a type of suffering that is very hard to rectify. But obviously, there are cures for spiritual and emotional trauma, especially. There's a video given by Glorian Publishing where they teach how to overcome spiritual trauma. It's called the Exercise of the Rose. It's a beautiful video. We can provide it for you that teaches how to overcome deep traumas that are, really affecting oneself, especially related to spirituality or spiritual groups, being hurt by communities or betrayed, especially. And those traumas can be helped with the medicine of the rose. Very deep practice you can do. Hit a comment. I did the rose exercise after losing my father. It helped immensely and the pain was lifted. Yes, I've used that exercise many times, especially facing trauma from or difficult circumstances from some spiritual communities I was a part of earlier in my, work. And it has been very powerful. It remedies so much. We have a question. Does trauma of the soul still involve ego? In the sense that much of our consciousness is trapped in the ego, right? We tend to be very mixed with these negative elements. In some sense, trauma can relate to, in a sense, mistransformations of energy. We weren't able to take in a situation or something negative happened to us, and it may affect our soul deeply. And in a sense, it can involve ego, depending on the circumstance. Maybe we did something that was harmful to ourselves or others. Only you can know. You have to study the book of your life. Some deep wounds are impacted by the egos of others, but also our own mistakes. We receive situations and experiences based on cause and effect, which go back, in a sense, in the deepest sense, to ancient times. We call that karma, return, recurrence. These events happen cyclically in different experiences and scenarios. So obviously, the deeper the trauma, I think, tends to be the deeper the egos involved, because our egos are very fat as of today, and before beginning this work. Any other questions? We have a question. What do you recommend I do about the resistance to studying Treatise of Revolutionary Psychology? As outlined in the next lecture of this series, observe your true self, observe yourself, observe your mind, observe your emotions. Any resistance, no matter the situation or circumstance, we have to observe our reactions to life. Now, whether it's resistance to doing something, a chore, or reading a book, or studying something, study yourself, observe your reactions. What in you is so resistant to a particular thing? Usually, when our mind or emotions have a resistance to something, it probably means that we need to pay more attention to it. I think there's an alchemical dictum that was cited by Jung that we should learn to look where we least want to. The thing we seek is found where we least want to look, right? It's kind of symbolized in those old Arthurian legends, like Le Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, where the knights all were looking for the Holy Grail, and they decided, let's look in the darkest place first, you know? In a sense, when we have tremendous resistance to something, we need to understand what in us is resistant to that action and to study that, observe that. Don't try to label it. Don't try to define it with words. Just look at the facts. What are your thoughts? What are your emotions? What are your impulses or desires? And study yourself. That's the beginning. We have a question. Can you explain detachment? How to use it to help observe oneself? Now, it's important to emphasize that with the practice of self-observation, we want to have a type of separation. The essence, the soul is learning to look at oneself, to look at our egos, right? We learn to separate in our attention or divide our attention. I think separate may be a bad word. I think division or to place your attention at two places at once. One of them is to observe one's mind, one's heart, one's body, one's desires, and then to observe also at the same time the environment. And some people have called this detachment. I think when we think of detachment, we think of nullity or dullness, like we're no longer associating, we're disassociated from life, and that's something very negative. The type of attention that we're teaching here is to, you know, look at two places at once, to divide attention, not in the sense like they're totally separate, but to, you know, be mindful, which has, in a sense, awareness of one's environment, but also pay attention to one's psychological states. That is the way that you make your consciousness more robust. You develop and exercise it. Our attention learns to see ourselves, but also we're aware of our environment and the relationship between the two. Some people have called it the key of soul, which means subject, object, location. It's an acronym. And subject is our mind, our emotions, our body. We're observing ourselves. Object is the environment, and location is also, our surroundings. And so we combine our attention to these things so that we can better understand our reactions, why we interact with the world in the way we do, how we think, how we feel, how we behave. It doesn't mean that we don't longer feel anything or are, in a sense, numb. It means that we learn to engage with life more actively, consciously, vividly, with a lot of attention and sensitivity, gathering details, understanding our reactions, but also gaining clarity and serenity in our perceptions. So we explain that a little bit further in a lecture in this series called Observe Your True Self. I recommend that you study that. We go into great detail into what the constituent aspects of self-observation entail in great emphasis. We give a lot of practices too on how to develop that sense of being, how to activate that state. We have a question. How can we help ourselves overcome laziness concerning the work? Study Samal Vayor. Study scripture. Study authentic writings from initiates, individuals who really mastered themselves. I don't mean people who we may be dubious about that we don't know. I mean tried and true, proven masters. Some scriptures can give us a lot of strength, especially when we meditate on them. Laziness often occurs because there is a defect in us that doesn't want to die. And so that laziness can creep into our life. And oftentimes it might require rekindling the flames of our inspiration. For me, that's always reading this literature. It helps a lot. Great Rebellion, Treatise of Revolutionary Psychology, The Revolution of the Dialectic, especially. Those three books emphasize how to work on oneself in great detail. If you find that you feel lazy, study those books. They're very synthesized and practical. And find the joy that you felt in the beginning by rekindling your fire at the altar of his writings, especially. They're very powerful. So, and scripture too. If you have a particular scripture that you have an affinity for that gives you a lot of strength, study that, meditate on that. That can give you hope. Any other questions? Person mentioned, yes, I've noticed my heart feels more empowered after reading Samael's books. Thank you. You're welcome. Me too. Any other questions? We have a question. How is our true selves related to each other? So in strict esoteric language, we say the true self is the being. And the being, our divine spiritual nature, is really what religions have called God. But we tend to veer away from that kind of language, not all the time, but because people have a lot of trauma, a lot of ideas, a lot of beliefs around that term, like an anthropomorphized figure in the clouds. We refer to the true self as the innermost, the spirit, and that is synonymous with divinity, the divine, God, for lack of a better word. Our true self, our spirit, our real nature is the divine spark that can take us to unity and liberation from suffering. Now, our being, our true self, our divinity never mixes with the ego. Our defects, our egos, ourselves, when compared to the being, are like oil and water. They can't mix. You can try to put them in a cup, but they'll never saturate. That's because divinity is pure and never mixes with impurity, with any ego. That's why the ego needs to die, so that the essence that is trapped in each self, each defect, each egotistical error can be integrated with the being. That is how we achieve religion, which is the Latin term for religare, reunion. So they relate to each other in the sense of adversarial contest, because our essence being trapped in each ego is suffering, and our divinity wants to free us from that pain, and therefore gives us the ordeals and situations of life to challenge us so that we can face our worst defects if we're looking at ourselves and changing. If not, we just get sucked into life. And so what happens is that our defects are, really characterized by the Hebrew term shaitan, which is the word where we get Satan. Shaitan in Hebrew means adversary. Our egos are the adversaries of God. They do not believe or respect the scriptures, divinity, religion, spirituality from a practical, pragmatic point. We may have egos of religiosity and fanaticism, ritualistic belief and adherence to a faith from a conventional sense, but that Phariseeism or dogmatic rigidity is another ego or defect that is adversarial to the revolutionary nature of the being. This is why in the scriptures, Christ was always at war, in a sense, spiritually, with the Pharisees, with the believers, people who represent, in that case, historically as a spiritual archetype, a type of battle in oneself. So that's the thing. Our selves are contrary to divinity, and therefore divinity wants to eliminate our defects so that the soul that is really the most noble part of us that is trapped in each ego, can be freed. And that is how we integrate our soul and become a true individual, a divine being. When the ego is fully dead, then the being can fully manifest within the person. In that sense, that is the ultimate goal of religion, or the ultimate goal of yoga too, because yoga comes from the Sanskrit yug, to reunite, to perfect. We have a question. What's your opinion on ayahuasca? Many people claim that it has helped them with trauma and also has helped them with the ego. Ayahuasca shows them their mistakes. Apologies, not sure this is a appropriate question. It's fine to ask that. We actually gave an article recently. Actually, this is a couple of years ago, but we've mentioned an article we've produced called "How Do Drugs Affect Our Spiritual Development?" We talk about that in great detail. We'll provide a link for you, just to synthesize, because there's much there that could be expounded upon. I think that article will help clarify. So we'll send it to you. We'll put it in the chat. Any other final questions? Okay. Well, I greatly appreciate the turnout. Thanks for attending, and be on the lookout online for future lectures coming up. So I thank you very much for attending. Appreciate it.